On the morning of December 7th, 1987, a man ordered a coffee at a small cafe. But he wasn't there for the coffee. He had been watching this cafe, waiting for a particular barista to start her shift. At 7:45 a.m., she finally arrived. The man had been waiting for this exact moment. So were the men outside. Because this woman wasn't just a barista. She had been responsible for dismantling the CIA's most valuable intelligence network in the last years. And now, she has nowhere to run. It was 1984. The United States and the Soviet Union had been enemies for decades. Two superpowers, two ideologies. Both wanted to shape the future of the world, and both saw the other as a threat standing in the way. But they never fought directly. Instead, they turned to espionage. The obvious move was to send American spies into Soviet territory, and the Soviets did the same. But that was dangerous, difficult, and easy to expose. So the CIA relied on something even more valuable. People who were already inside. Soviet citizens who were willing to secretly pass information to America. The CIA called them assets, until they stopped being helpful. Permanently. On the morning of December 7th, 1984, a military official left his house in Moscow and never arrived at his office. His car was found on a quiet road outside the city at 8 a.m. It had veered off the road and hit a tree. He was still behind the wheel. Cardiac arrest, the report said. To Soviet investigators, it was a tragic accident. But to the CIA, he was a major loss. For years, he had been passing information out of rooms that no American would ever be allowed inside. Documents, conversations, and decisions made at the highest level of the Soviet military. And now, he was gone. He would not be the last. A nuclear physicist named Dr. Viktor Sokolov, Leningrad, May 17, 1985. A career soldier named Captain Sergei Mazarov, Kiev, October 25, 1985. A civil servant named Nikolai Petrov, Moscow, March 30, 1986. A mid-level administrator named Anatoly Mikhailov, Minsk, August 17, 1986. A history professor named Lev Askarov, Minsk, March 3, 1987. These 5 people died the same way as the first. A cardiac arrest while driving. To the Soviet authorities handling each case, there was nothing suspicious. They were all just accidents, and accidents happen all the time. They also lived in different cities, worked different jobs, had never met each other. But this man saw something nobody did. Peter Calloway was a CIA case officer. His job was to find Soviet citizens willing to turn against their own country and feed secrets back to America. Under various covers, he spent his career moving through the edges of the Soviet world. Academic conferences, diplomatic receptions, and trade delegations. And when the timing was right, he would make contact and slowly build a relationship. Then, he applied a framework that ultimately turned Soviet citizens into assets. M.I.C.E. M stands for money. I stands for ideology. C stands for compromise. And E stands for ego. Money was often the simplest and easiest. It was the perfect offer to a Soviet official who felt underpaid and undervalued by the very government he served. Ideology took more patience. It worked best on a Soviet true believer who had spent decades loyal to the system and had slowly, quietly stopped believing in it. Compromise was what Peter liked least. Every Soviet official had a secret he couldn't bring to his superiors. Peter found it and made it clear that cooperation was the only way it stayed buried. Ego was often the most powerful of all. It was the perfect approach for a Soviet loyalist who had spent his entire career being ignored and overlooked by the state he had given everything to. Using the M.I.C.E framework, Peter had successfully recruited 7 assets across the Soviet division in the past 7 years. Each one of them was handed off to a handler after the initial approach. He wasn't supposed to keep track of them after that, and he didn't. Until he saw familiar names reported in Soviet newspapers. Out of his 7 recruits, 6 were dead. In all of the reports, they were all accidents. But Peter felt differently. Someone had been targeting his people. And if that was true, his remaining recruit was next. A week later, Peter arrived at the CIA headquarters, and he wasn't there for a routine visit. He requested an emergency meeting with Richard Cole, the chief of the counterintelligence division. Richard's job was to protect the Soviet insiders from exactly this kind of threat and to find the leaks before they become disasters. 6 of my recruits are dead, Peter said. All Soviet insiders. Richard wasn't shocked. You're not the only case officer with that problem. Peter had always known that there were other case officers too, but he didn't know their names, let alone the names of their recruits. That was when Richard revealed the bigger problem. 34 out of the 35 Soviet insiders had been eliminated across the entire division, and other officers had lost everyone. Peter was down to his last. Richard had 2 theories. The first was a mole. Someone inside the CIA was leaking names to the Soviets, who then ordered the eliminations. The second was simpler, and in some way, worse. Peter's remaining asset betrayed the others to save themselves. That was when Richard turned to Peter with a proposition. I'll keep looking into the mole theory, but I want you to monitor your remaining asset. Peter's remaining asset was a biochemist named Nina Malkova from Moscow. When he recruited her, she hadn't done it for money. She'd done it because she believed in America more than her own country. She even called the Soviet Union a global bully. But conviction was the easiest thing in the world to fake. And to prove that she was a traitor, he needed to look closer. So, he booked a flight. For the next 6 weeks, Peter watched Ninel from a distance and studied her routine. Ninel was out of her apartment by 6:15 a.m., drove to a cafe first to get her coffee fix, and then to the laboratory by 7:15. She arrived early and left late. By evening, she would leave documents in designated locations. These were called dead drops, a method of passing information without direct contact. A hollowed-out book left on a park bench. A marked chalk line on a lamppost signals a new package. Peter didn't notice anything suspicious, and that was because there really wasn't. When Peter flew back to Langley, the news was already waiting for him. Richard had found the suspect. There was a mole inside the CIA. The name was classified, not enough to say it out loud. But here was what they had. So far, the mole had been seen meeting a KGB agent on 3 separate occasions. And that wasn't the only disturbing part. Each meeting had fallen on the same day an asset had died, in the same city, where the body turned up. For the first time, Peter felt something like relief. But that didn't last long. With the investigation still open and recruitment temporarily frozen, Peter was reassigned as an analyst, so it was mainly desk work. Usually, he was asked to do foreign press reviews, Soviet newspapers and state media. That morning, he was going through his usual stack of Soviet newspapers when he stopped at a headline. For Peter, that was alarming. All of the Soviet insiders were now dead. When he spoke with Richard, the man seemed just as frustrated. He even let slip a small, offhand remark. Poor woman. She liked black coffee. But then he gave Peter some good news. The mole had been seen again, with a KGB agent, and traced to Moscow. A trap was already being set. Despite the news, Peter didn't feel relieved this time. He felt impatient. Why was Richard taking so long? But that wasn't the only question looming in his head. Why had Richard made that comment about the coffee? You see, the news article said the biochemist had been found dead in her car. Cardiac arrest. She'd been just 15 minutes from her workplace. Peter cross-checked the time against his own surveillance notes. The biochemist was an early riser. Coffee before work. At her desk by 7:15. Peter had noted that she stopped for coffee every morning. That was in the report. But the order? Black? That was never written down. It was a trivial detail, something Peter himself hadn't even noticed. So how did Richard know? Peter thought about it for a moment. Then it hit him. Psychology 101. A Freudian slip. When the unconscious mind betrays what the conscious mind is trying to hide. A small, unguarded moment. The kind of mistake careful people make when they feel too safe. Richard Cole had felt too safe. And in one offhand comment about coffee, he had given Peter everything. So all 7 of Peter's recruits were dead. But this time, he stopped looking at the cause. The cardiac arrests behind the wheel were a given. This time, he looked at everything around the deaths. The first thing was the time of death. All 7 died in the morning, before work, before they reached where they were going. The second was the routine. His report had his recruits stopping for coffee every morning on the way in. He couldn't confirm the other 6, but he'd have bet they were no different. If he was right, someone was getting something into the coffee. Something that triggered a cardiac arrest behind the wheel. Minutes later, before the target ever arrived. Whether that someone was Richard, or someone Richard was directing, he didn't know yet. So he watched him, with another pair of eyes. Peter never doubted his ability to recruit. The CIA may have frozen recruiting Soviet insiders in the meantime, but that didn't stop Peter from recruiting a different kind of asset. A college student from Langley who needed rent money. Fine arts major. Never left home without his camera. His instructions were simple. Follow a certain man. Take note of his routine. Photograph everything. Don't be obvious. For the next 3 days, the student did the assignment. When he was done, he met Peter and shared what he had learned. Richard's routine was airtight. Out of the house at 7:30 a.m. Into Langley. Lunch alone. Home by evening. Same routine. Same timing. every single day. Peter went through the photos one by one. Richard leaving his house. Richard at headquarters. Richard eating lunch alone. Richard walking on a sidewalk. Then he stopped. In one photo, Richard was walking on the sidewalk. His hand moved, slipping something into the opening of the bag of a woman who was passing in the opposite direction. Peter looked at the woman's face in the photograph. He had spent 20 years in rooms full of Soviet officials, diplomatic receptions, trade delegations, academic conferences. After a while, you stopped needing a name or an accent. He just knew. The woman was Soviet. And Richard just handed her something on a sidewalk. The next morning came, and Peter knew what he was about to do was risky. Walking into the FBI with classified intelligence about an active CIA operation was the kind of thing that ended careers, maybe worse. But if he was right, then the CIA didn't just have a leak. It had a traitor. He walked in anyway. There, he spoke with a senior agent from the counterintelligence division. He put the photograph on the table, then told him his theory. Richard Cole was the mole himself, and he had been passing intelligence to a Soviet operative. Names, routines, locations. And that operative had been using it to find and eliminate CIA assets one by one. The woman in the photograph, he believed, was a Soviet woman. But the senior agent wasn't fully convinced. If Peter was right, there was still a possibility the Soviet woman was on their side, a double agent. Someone Richard was running privately, outside normal channels. And the FBI had a point. Except that in the CIA, contact with an insider followed a system. Dead drops, chalk markers, a hollowed-out book on a park bench, a signal that meant something only to the two people who agreed on it beforehand. Peter pointed out that what happened on that sidewalk was none of those things. When Richard saw the director across the room, he assumed it was a routine briefing. The director called those all the time. But a few seconds later, the FBI walked in. They hadn't come empty-handed. In the 48 hours since Peter's visit, they had pulled every surveillance report Richard had ever filed and cross-referenced them against every kill date, every city, every victim. The pattern was already there before Richard sat down. They had the photograph and the reports. Richard had known every detail in those files before anyone else, because he had built them himself. The connection was undeniable. Then, Richard made the only calculation left. He told them everything. For the last 7 years, Richard had been asking case officers to submit detailed surveillance reports on their recruits, their daily routines, their habits, and where they stopped in the morning. Standard procedure, he told them. Better documentation. But it was never about documentation. He was working with a Soviet spy who needed to know exactly when and where to find them. The surveillance reports gave her everything, and to keep the hunt pointed away from himself, Richard had invented the mole leads entirely. The KGB sightings, the trail to Moscow, all of it. He was running the investigation, so he controlled what it found. When the director asked for the real name of his partner, he didn't say anything. Not yet. But Richard did say what made him cooperate with the enemy. It started with debt, a divorce, a house he couldn't afford on a government salary, But something along the way, the money stopped being the reason. He had spent 30 years watching America make decisions that cost other people everything. The assets, the handlers, the families who never knew why their husbands didn't come home. He had stopped believing the work was worth the cost. So when a Soviet spy offered him an arrangement, he didn't hesitate. She got her targets. He got his revenge. The director laid it out plainly. 35 assets were dead because of the files Richard passed across the sidewalk. Under federal law, that was a capital offense. They could pursue every charge. Richard's composure broke. And what he promised he would not do, he did. On the morning of December 5th, 1987, Irina Volkova walked through the airport. It was her time again to go to the US, but she had a layover in Vienna. When the immigration officer asked her what she would do, she confidently answered, "For pleasure." She just quit her job as a barista and needed to unwind. She handed over her passport. The officer stamped it without looking up. The following morning, Irina arrived in Langley, Virginia. She walked the same sidewalk she always did, and as per usual, Richard appeared, slipping something into her bag without breaking a stride. When she got to her hotel, she opened the package. She knew what was inside. A file. She had done this before, 35 times. But not all 35 died in her hands. She had people in Leningrad, Kiev, and Minsk. Local contacts who knew the cities better than she ever could. She gave them the routine. They handled the rest. Clean and quiet every time. That was the system. But this time, the file was different. Because her next target wasn't a Soviet insider. It was the CIA director himself. This was the one they had always been building toward. The assets were never the end goal. They were just the foundation. Eliminate the network first, then take down the man who built it. Richard had wanted this from the beginning. So had she. The CIA director would be her 36th kill. And she would do it the same way she had killed the others. She would slip potassium chloride into the cup, odorless and tasteless. It left nothing behind for an examiner to find. By the time the heart stopped, the compound had already dissolved into the body's own chemistry. The cause of death was always the same. That was the secret to why she had never been caught. The note mentioned a cafe in Langley. The job was already arranged. This was no surprise given that Richard had a lot of connections in the city. All she had to do was appear and do the job. The next morning, at exactly 7:45 a.m., Irina arrived at the coffee shop. After speaking with the manager, she put on her apron and worked behind the counter. She didn't need training. She had been making coffee for years. This was what it had all been for. Every asset, every file, every cup of coffee she had ever prepared. It all led here. She stood behind the counter and watched the door. There he was. Irina took out her notebook and approached the CIA director's table. But just as she was about to take her pen out of her pocket, she sees a gun pointed at her face. After a few seconds, FBI agents stood up from their seats and some poured through the doors. Badges out, weapons drawn. Irina didn't run, but she was stunned. It was a setup. Richard betrayed her. She just stood there, notepad in hand, and looked at the men surrounding her. It was over. For now. Later that day, Irina Volkova was charged and taken into federal custody. Richard Cole, the chief of the counterintelligence division, was charged as well. But because he had cooperated fully, his sentence was significantly reduced. He never knew it was Peter who had tipped off the FBI. He probably never would. But 10 days later, the unexpected happened. Irina's cell was empty. Nobody knew how she got out. There were no signs of forced entry or explanation that held her under scrutiny. It wasn't Richard, because he was already locked away, with no means and no reason. But someone had helped her. To this day, Irina Volkova is still on the run. She had spent years hunting people who betrayed their country. In the end, someone who betrayed his own did the same for her.